So there was a real exponential increase in the number of reports. We went from 1 or 2 to dozens. By the week of July 26th, we had received reports of 80 sick or dead deer. And most of these were in eastern Kentucky. And by the first week of August, we had 400 plus cases reported to us. So,
and the key word is reported.
reported.
Yeah,
Right, so there might, yeah, exactly. There were likely more that were not reported to us. So a lot of these photos are courtesy of our biologist, Jason Plaxico. So we had a lot of our biologists and law enforcement staff investigate, to go out to investigate these reports. Majority of them were deer that were basically reported dead to us. Like I said, a lot of them floating in water. We had reports of some sick deer. Here's a couple photographs. So this is a pretty terrible disease. You can see the deer here on the left. It's kind of got a head tilt, so it's in the terminal stages of disease, showing some neurological symptoms. We've got, sorry guys, we've got a deer thrashing around in the mud that's just weak, unable to stand. And here you can see in this photograph, the next slide, you've got some facial swelling and edema, so fluid buildup underneath the jaw there. And this is terrible. I don't know if you can see that, probably too small for you, but the eyelids are completely red and hemorrhagic. So it's developed some conjunctival hemorrhage. So these deer were in pretty rough shape. So pretty terrible disease. So our biologists collected tissues for testing so we could confirm EHD. And we had confirmation by early August that we were dealing with EHD2, which is the most common strain of EHD that we see here in Kentucky that's been associated with outbreaks. So this is relevant to you as well, because if you do have a die-off of deer on your property, you're probably going to want to have them tested. So that, the best thing to do would be to call your veterinarian and have them come out and collect samples. You can also collect samples yourself. And so typically the best samples to collect are the spleen and the lung. So there's a common myth where people think that, well, since I'm collecting samples for CWD and I'm collecting the head, that's going to be good enough to test for EHD or blue tongue. Well, it's not. You can't test the brain tissue for EHD or blue tongue. So you really do need the lung or spleen tissue to be able to test for it. So you just need a small sample. You can keep it refrigerated for a few days before you send it out to a lab. Okay? And any of our diagnostic labs, so Breathitt in Murray and UK Veterinary Diagnostic Lab in Lexington will do the testing for you. Okay? Okay, so here's the epidemic curve of our outbreak. So this is just showing you the peak number of cases, reports that were received. So as you can see, we started receiving reports in July, and by mid to late August, we were receiving 700 plus reports per week, or reports of 700 plus sick or dead deer each week. And that started to trail off in late September, early October, as the temperatures started to cool, so midge activity started to die off or die down, and then by, I believe, mid-October, we had our first frost. So that effectively killed off the midges and put an end to the outbreak. So these outbreaks do end with the first frost, okay? So unlike chronic wasting disease, this is a disease, we're going to see it, it's going to be really bad, and then it's going to be over. And that doesn't mean we're going to get it back again the next year. So, all right. So this is a map of Kentucky. I don't know if you can all see that, but you can see where our cases were concentrated. So by the end of the season, so this is early November, we had received a total of over 4,600 reports, or 4,600 sick or dead deer across the state. And as you can see, majority of these were in the Appalachian Plateau region. So that was really interesting, because usually when we have an EHD outbreak, it's pretty widespread. Previous outbreaks have been statewide. But this past year it was really interesting, because although we had some reports from across the state, really the great majority of them were across the Appalachian Plateau, and that actually stretched from southeastern Tennessee to northeastern Ohio and Pennsylvania, and they actually had a few cases in southwestern Ontario and Canada later in the season as well. So this was a pretty interesting outbreak this past summer. So the other thing that was really interesting about it was, now with everybody having their smartphones, everybody's got this amazing GPS technology. We actually got a lot of GPS coordinates and specific locations reported. Part of this was we had a great online reporting system, so it was pretty easy for folks to go online and report like our dead deer. So we were able to develop these really informative maps with like to a very fine spatial scale. So you can see here, and if you look, this is we were able to overlay with different land features such as stream level. And if you zoom in on Floyd County here, where we had a majority of our reports here in the epicenter of our EHD outbreak, you can see how well they do align with the rivers and streams in the region, which is expected. If you look at, okay, so this is eastern Kentucky for you. So we have really rugged, mountainous terrain, heavily forested, and you can maybe see these little dots, but all of the reports were received along rivers and streams, which really isn't surprising considering that's where the people are, that's where the roadways are, and the rest of the terrain is very highly, very rugged, and I'm sure that there were many cases underreported as well that were just not, found because they weren't accessible to the public. Okay. So one really interesting aspect of this investigation was the fact that we actually had a study that had been going on for 3 years, and we had some deer in K.A.L.A County that had VHF collars. So historically in eastern Kentucky, we haven't seen we had really low deer populations, and we're trying to figure out why. So there was a study on deer survival, and over 3 years we tracked this population of deer in K.A.L.A County. Now that study finished in January of 2017, and the last time we monitored those collars was in April. So it wasn't until mid-August, so at this point we were receiving hundreds of reports of dead deer across the state, and we realized, oh my god, we've got this calling deer out on the landscape, and this is potentially like this amazing treasure trove of information that we can use to study this outbreak. So we went out to investigate, and we had 59 deer with detectable frequencies, and 20 of those, so nearly a third of them, were in mortality mode, meaning they had died. So we tracked those collars once a week for the rest of the month, and by the end of September we had a total of 25 mortalities, and that's for a mortality rate of 42.5%. So 42.5% of our collared deer had died, which is extremely high. Now the kind of relevant thing to this is that we actually, over the course of that 3-year study, we had 89% annual survival. And we didn't have a single deer die as a result of disease. So we highly suspected that these deer had died as a result of EHD. So this is just a map showing where these deer were found. And you can see the dead deer were found in K.A.L.A County along 2 river drainages and the proximity to other EHD reports in the area. Okay. So these carcasses were unfortunately in a pretty advanced state of decomposition when we found them. So this is what they looked like. So that means we unfortunately weren't able to do complete necropsies on them. So ideally what would happen, and ideally this would happen if you had any deer die on your property, is you call your veterinarian to come out and do a necropsy and try to identify the cause of death right away. Well, we didn't have that luxury. In fact, some of our deer were pretty well decomposed, and we just had like a sack of bones basically and a collar. So there was hardly anything left. But we decided to follow through and see if we can get the bones tested. So the idea was that because EHD is a virus and it's found in the bloodstream, it would also be found in the bone marrow. So we collected these sacks of bones from these deer. We were able to collect bones from 12 of the 25 mortalities, and 58.3% of them tested positive for EHD, which is extremely high. Now the ones that tested negative, some of these we scraped, we opened up the bone and there was no bone marrow remaining. So they were really decomposed, which is probably why we had some negative test results. And so if you're wondering whether or not you can test bones from a rotten carcass for EHD, you can. So, if it's been a week and you didn't realize the deer was dead and it's found in the back of your pen, you can still have it tested. Okay, so as I mentioned, our mortality rate was 42.5%, and taking into consideration the 58.3% that tested positive, extrapolating that to our total doe population, That gives us an EHD-related mortality rate of 24.7%. And that's pretty similar to what's been reported in literature. But if you take into consideration where these deer were found, so along two river drainages, proximity to our other EHD reports, in our EHD outbreak zone, and the fact that we were working with really rotten bones, it's likely that the actual mortality rate was as high as 42.5% in that doe population. And that is a lot higher than what's been previously reported.
In Floyd and Pike County, about 80% of the deer are gone. And I was in there helping a lot this year.
Yeah, we had, that was, you know, really the epicenter. That's when we received most of our reports.
It started really early there.
Mm-hmm.
It was devastating.
Yeah, Floyd and Pike counties were hit really, really hard.
And last fall, Dr. Keogh had brought up, Bradley Keogh's the assistant state veterinarian. He brought up that although they may not actually die of blue tongue or EHD, that virus, if once they get bitten, can weaken their immune system, where they could possibly, is that?
No, because the ones that die, they die of, like I mentioned, acute EHD, so they will die within a week of infection. So they're not going to have time to be infected with anything else. So these deer that we're seeing dead, they had just died of EHD.
Okay.
What he's saying though is that they get this, and then a few months later, their immune system hadn't built back up yet, and then pneumonia,
Sure.
something like that.
That would apply to the chronically infected ones. So
Okay,
so the
okay,
survivors.
okay.
Yeah, so if they survived the initial infection, then yes, it would be like having a cold or flu or any other virus. It's going to weaken your immune system. So you would be more susceptible to pneumonia or other disease.
A quick question.
Yeah.
You said that it was tested for the EHD2 type 2 virus.
Yeah.
So if you have that information and your deer have already been exposed, if you give them that vaccination, it's not going to do any good because they're already exposed to it.
Right, yeah, so the vaccine is like exposing the animal. Usually a vaccine's like a weaker form of the virus, so they're not actually going to get sick from it. But the same principle. So if they've been exposed and they've survived, then yeah, it's like being vaccinated and even having a stronger version of a vaccine than if you were actually to inject them.
But I agree with her. If you see the EHD2, you see it in their eyes, they start getting red. I'm 100% agree. We had it in our pens 2007, 2008. They died.
Yeah, they die.
They're hemorrhaged.
Yeah, because at that point, when they're showing symptoms, they're already very sick and the disease is very, very well progressed. So at that point, there's not really much you can do.
And I had one other question.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no
So you said that they like the salty water. Is
Yeah.
there something that you can do to change the alkaline of your water? Is there something that you can add to it?
I don't know that. I know that they like salty water, but yeah, I'm not sure about changing that but yeah, maybe something to look into. Yeah. So you might be interested. I don't know if any of you actually hunt in Kentucky, but the big question was, how does this impact our harvest? So actually, we had it really did impact our harvest this year. So we saw anywhere from 30 to 70% decline in harvest across the Appalachian region here in Kentucky. Now, a lot of that was probably attributed to hunters actually not buying licenses. So we had a significant decline in the number of hunters who actually purchased licenses. So a little bit of self-policing going on where hunters just said, well, you know what, we've lost so many deer, I'm not going to go hunting this year. So probably that accounted for a lot of it. But it was pretty, as you can see, Pike, Floyd counties here, around 70% declines in harvest. Okay. So one thing we did do after the outbreak was we collected blood samples from deer across the region. And this is kind of relevant to you because this is something you can actually do for your captive herd. So we had just blood sampling kits, little blood vials that we handed to hunters, and they voluntarily, when they harvested their deer, they collected a blood sample for us. And so what we were able to do with that is we were able to learn about the level of exposure in the survivors and also the level of immunity. So like what we were talking about with the vaccination, how many deer had been exposed and how many of those are going to be resistant to a future outbreak. So here are the results. So in eastern Kentucky, we had anywhere from 64 to 83% of survivors that had antibodies to EHD, meaning they had been exposed and survived. So what that means is most of the deer that were harvested that season in the fall had been exposed to EHD and survived infection. Okay, so we've got a pretty good level of immunity. We expect if we have another outbreak of EHD2, those deer are going to be resistant. So Western Kentucky, small sample size, we had no deer that had been exposed, which wasn't unexpected given the few reports we had in the area. But what was really interesting is you can see that 2.4%. So at one of our wildlife management areas, K.A.L.A Wildlife Management Area, only 1 out of 42 deer had been exposed to EHD. And if you look at the map, you think, oh, that's kind of unusual. Like, it's right on the border. We had all of these dead deer, but only 1 of the deer had been exposed. So if we kind of look at K.A.L.A Wildlife Management Area, it spans Floyd. Well, actually, it's in this area. So Floyd, Nicholas, and Nicholas, Bath, and Fleming counties. Okay, and the 1 deer that was positive was actually from Bath County. We did not have any reports of EHD at all at K.A.L.A Wildlife Management Area. But as you can see, we had a ton of reports just east of there. So less than 20 miles east of the area, we had a ton of reports. So basically, this is showing us how much variation you can have in EHD exposure on a very small spatial scale. So still a larger scale than your farm, but if you look at the county level, it really does matter whether you're, which part of the county you're in, and it's possible that, you might have a lot of EHD in one part of the county, and then 20 miles away, you're not going to have any EHD. Okay. So just to summarize, okay, so we had an outbreak of EHD that was attributed to EHD2, which is the most common strain that we see here in Kentucky. It was distributed across the Appalachian Plateau. We still don't know why it was across the Appalachian Plateau, what made that, why it was delineated that way. Still got a lot to learn about that. And we had significant regional mortality ranging anywhere from 24.7 to 42.5%. And like I said, we had variable exposure that seemed to range even within a county or between different river drainages within a county. So why did we have an EHD outbreak this past summer? So there's a number of theories. So one is that we have waning immunity in the population. So we had our last major outbreaks in 2007 and 2012. So maybe all the deer that had been exposed at the time had already died, and the surviving deer had no immunity or had lost immunity since then. I don't know if you recall, but last winter was very mild, 2016, 2017. And so we had reports of large midge populations as early as May. So we had a state entomologist, he was actually out in western Kentucky, and he said, usually I catch 1 or 2 midges, and this year I've caught hundreds of midges. So having a mild winter would have resulted in increased overwintering of the midge larvae, and giving those midge populations a real boost in the summer.
Is there any way us deer farmers can get that information? I run a missile system, but I only run it every few days when there's a problem in the area. When I know it's coming. You hear about it coming, but I mean, we're all in different parts of the state. Is there any way to get that information to know how many he's catching versus not many at all?
So no one's actually, we haven't done that research yet, but we're talking about it.
You just told me you've done the research.
It wasn't us, it was a state entomologist, he's no
Okay.
longer here, and he wasn't actually trapping for midges. So he was actually trapping for mosquitoes, and he happened to catch some midges.
Okay.
So this wasn't like a midge research project, he just called us and told us, hey, I'm just giving you a heads up, there seem to be a lot of midges here.
Right.
But what we're talking about now is actually working with some academic university researchers and studying these midge populations, because we don't know anything about midge populations in Kentucky.
These purple traps we see up, what are
Yeah.
those for? Mosquitoes or any kind of insect? Or
We're not, so our agency isn't doing any trapping right now, so it might be the Department of Public Health, and they
Okay.
might be trapping for mosquitoes. So they've started some mosquito surveillance, and that's what it could be. But unfortunately, we haven't had the funding, and so this is just something we're talking about developing. But I can't Unfortunately, I can't tell you, where the what the midge populations are like. So also we had some low precipitation. So in June we didn't have a lot of rain in eastern Kentucky, and you know how I mentioned, with drought you might have increased exposure of those muddy banks. So potentially with a dry June we could have had increased or suitable habitat for midges. But it wasn't as clear as previous years where it's always been associated with a drought, because we actually had a lot of rain in July and August, and we didn't have a drought in Kentucky this summer.
Quick question
Yeah.
for you. Did they, when he was tracking for mosquitoes? Yeah, he said that he had a large amount of mosquitoes.
I didn't ask. I'm not sure. No, he accidentally trapped midges in his mosquito traps.
Okay, I was just wondering if maybe there was a correlation between a high mosquito count and a high midge count because of them liking the same environment. I'm just wondering.
No, that's a good question. But actually, so mosquitoes, there's like dozens of different species in Kentucky, and they all have different habitat preferences. But the difference between mosquitoes and midges is mosquitoes like deep water, so they'll breed in any pool of water, whereas midges are very specific. So they need like that really shallow water. So the habitat doesn't really overlap.
And there again with your deer pens, that's why we, in a perfect world, you wouldn't want any pools of water. You want to, try to keep your pens mowed, because if you keep them mowed, one, you can find fawns, which is important, but two, when the wind does blow, when the sun comes out, it'll dry up. And so I know in our pens, we've got some muddy spots. And so what we try to do, which I know we're going to do this year, is definitely fill those in with gravel. So that's, as far as trying the preventive side, is keeping those pens dry. And I know it just depends on your layout.
Yeah, I know. So before I finish up here, so basically there's still a lot we don't know about EHD and blue tongue, and so this outbreak was really a big learning experience. It was really informative to us. We were able to get really good reporting data from the public. And there are things we're going to be looking at. So we are going to start looking at midge populations. We're hopefully going to set up some partnerships with some midge specialists across the state, and maybe we can start a program where we're trapping midges early in the season. Because right now we have no way of predicting whether an outbreak of EHD or blue tongue will occur. We're just not there yet. So, but there are things that you can do as producers on your property, and as far as managing your deer populations, and fly control is one of them. I know that Mike had some handouts he might email you that I sent him that have some recommendations for fly control, and then some of these habitat improvements that we talked about.
And there's a lot of other info. I went through the last 4 years of all of these deer magazines and emails, and I'm going to put together like a little booklet that goes from, basically through the 4 seasons of raising deer. So, from fawn care to artificial insemination to EHD and blue tongue. So there's a lot of information out there in addition to what Fish and Wildlife has.
Yeah, and one thing I didn't mention is there is a vaccine available, or you can have a vaccine produced. So it's kind of like the flu vaccine where they have to produce a new one every year. So it's the same thing with the EHD. So if there's an outbreak of EHD, you can send tissues, like I said, long or spleen tissues to a lab. It's an out-of-state lab, and they'll make a vaccine for you for your deer. I don't know how much it costs, and in order to get approved to use the vaccine, you do have to go through the Department of Agriculture, and they have to approve it for you. So there's a bit of a process to get that vaccine approved. Now, if you're in the midst of an EHD outbreak, it may already be too late to produce a vaccine, but if it's early in the season, and you can get a hold of some tissues, which we'd be normally happy to supply you with some tissue samples if you wanted to do that, it's something for you to consider. So I don't know a lot about the vaccine. We don't use it in wildlife populations, but if that's something you wanted to invest to do for your deer population, that's something that you can do. So, all right.
Barry, you have a question?
Yes, do we know how the midge contracts the disease or becomes a carrier?
Yes, so we have to pick it up from an infected animal, which could be a deer, it could be a cow, it could be an elk. So any animal that has it in its bloodstream.
You have a healthy deer, an infected midge bites that deer, and then a healthy midge bites that same
Yes.
deer, so he's a carrier then.
Right, exactly, so yeah. So a healthy midge bites a sick deer, yeah, and then becomes infected, bites the next deer.
And like Ega said, you know, it's some of you that I've talked to, and, you know, in a perfect world, all you would want to raise on your farm or proximity to your deer herd is just deer. You know, I've been told by other farmers that, you know, it's in your best interest if you want to do this, you know, to try to keep it away from other livestock, be it, you know, for that reason. You know, because not only with the midge fly or EHD blue tongue, but other diseases as well. There's a story, and I know Joe and some of these other guys know of a farm down in Alabama. This guy raised, in addition to deer, he had all kinds of other livestock. And even though he had them in a separate pen across the highway, he would go over there, and then he'd go back to his deer pens. Well, he didn't clean his boots or whatever, so whatever those diseases, and they're not to scare people, but it wiped out his entire herd. But that's, you know,
Sure,
so.
yeah, and it's the same thing. So yeah, a lot of species of livestock have the similar diseases as deer can get. Same with, you know, wild deer, and so yeah, there's always a risk. So, you know, tuberculosis, brucellosis, other diseases can be transmitted across species. So.
Okay, so in terms of the vaccines, I recently visited 23 farms in about 10 days, and I did something very similar a couple years ago. A couple years ago, I did maybe 3 of them vaccinated. This past year when I went, every one of those 23 farms are vaccinated on 3HD.
Okay.
And I don't know whether that's because of the hysteria, they've had big losses, and they're just struggling to do something, or they truly believe in it. I know Joe's vaccinated in previous years and lost deer. I don't know, maybe it's something as time goes, we can just get our head around it. Because it's probably the most widely discussed and controversial, you know, do you do it or not, you know?
Yeah, and I have no idea how much it costs or how much, you know, it puts you out to do it, but from what I understand, it does work. But I don't know.
It does. In 2008, 10, we had some PhD. Made vaccine every year, so any deer we lost with the vaccine. 2012, when it hit, it was we lost over half a herd because it was
Different strain, yeah.
so
Right.
more
So
than one strain.
yeah, so I think that's why you have to develop this vaccine every year, because
But
every outbreak's a little bit different.
I mean, we had one, but we didn't have 2 left. So our vaccine for 12 vaccine was 1, those 2 is the killer.
Yeah, two's the big one. But yeah, we've had EHD6, we've had blue tongue 17, we've had a few different strains in Kentucky. Usually EHD2, so that's probably your best bet, but yeah, it can vary by strain. So, all right, well, I'll be around for a little while if you have any questions later, and yeah.
Yeah, I think it would help if you could give me that PowerPoint or whatever, and then we can put it on our website.
Yeah, we actually have a lot of this. Well, I think probably what would be best is I'll just send you a link to our website because we have a lot of this on our website.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks. All right. Yeah, just to kind of get a track.
Well, I understand that if, like I was getting hard to burn, I did hard to
If you want to.
do the survive in our farm are almost resistant.
I would think so. But I mean, it might be resistant for a year though, or for 2 years. It just.
Or I wonder if the fawns, the doe fawns,
Yes.
they would be resistant too?
Yes, so for 4 or 5 months, the does pass maternal antibodies to the fawns. And if the does have been exposed, the fawns will be resistant for about 4 or 5 months, for the first season, for the first year of life. Yes.
And not to scare people, but like, we lost, my dad and I, we were losing almost 1 a week. And it sounds like we lost like 10, but we had in excess of 150 deer. And to give you an idea about it, is it just hit in one pen. And so, you know, as far as preventive, I mean, we had our pens, we've got mesh fence up. And so to some of your question is, so those midge flies, there's no way